we have our orchid expert, Dr. Jim Ackerman. Jim received his PhD from Florida State University and is now a professor and director of the Natural History Collections at University of Puerto Rico. He has written over 125 scientific articles and 3 books, so we can definitely label him as an expert. He's currently focusing on the non-native pines and orchids of Puerto Rico and population studies of native earth orchids in the Caribbean. Please give a warm Sea&Learn welcome to Jim Ackerman.
Okay, invasive orchids. Now, I'm not real sure what I was supposed to talk about. So you're going to get what you're going to get, and I will eventually bring it to Saba. Okay, so bear with me. All right, let's. Do I have a remote?
1 second.
It's on the next slide, Devin.
Go ahead, Jim.
Oh, okay. Invasions. This happens to be the fact of life. You thought the fact of life was something else, I'm sure, but this is truly the fact of life. And you know, all kinds of organisms invade. You have viruses, you have bacteria, you have algae, you have cacti, you have flies, you have humans. You know, so everybody does it. So why worry about this? I mean, it's a big issue these days, but you know, why worry? You know, is our way of life, you know, even our survival at risk here? Well, this was an issue that was bouncing around way back in the 50s, the Invasion of the Body Snatchers. How many people here have seen that movie? Well, I shouldn't raise my hand. I've never seen it, but you can tell me about the movie. Yeah, sometime.
Who one did I see?
Okay, I guess what I need to do, you know, when I'm talking about invasions, I'm going to have to define things a little bit, because there's a zillion definitions of what invasion is. And the way I'm going to define it is that it is human-assisted. And it is...
Human-assisted.
She's invading my space. And that this invasion involves several stages. One stage, the initial stage, is establishment. Well, first stage is actually getting to a novel place. And then you become established. This is nice. And then you reproduce. That's a pretty critical situation. And then subsequent dispersal. Going from your initial spot of establishment and starting to spread. And that becomes an invasion. Okay. Well, immediately I'm jumping to orchids. From humans to orchids. Can orchids be invasive? Well, there's no doubt everybody here thinks of orchids as being these exotic, rare things. And it is true. There are many species of orchids, even orchids here on Saba, that are quite rare. And here's one, the wacky from Dominican Republic. But there are many other orchids that like kind of weedy habitats that you might find alongside roadsides or landslides or something like that. So you have many species that have a preference for disturbed habitats. And one of the things about occupying disturbed habitats is disturbed habitats don't become disturbed for very long. Actually, what happens is, you know, you disturb a habitat, plants grow, and the vegetation changes, and eventually you get the original vegetation. If you follow the successional processes as expected. The other thing is that there's a great deal of resiliency, which means that, okay, the habitat changes, so they can move to another disturbed habitat. So you gotta have a high dispersal and ability to propagate yourselves fairly quickly. And this is one of the orchids in Ecuador that grows along roadsides and things like that. Okay. So actually, a lot of orchids are what I call the daughters of disturbance. And they really like disturbed habitats. In fact, this is a species that occurs here, Sequoia lanceolata. And if you go down Spring Shade Trail a little ways, you'll find it, or take the Bud's Mountain Trail, you'll find it. It's not flower right now. Wait until the spring. And I have it growing in my lawn. And I always mow my lawn. And then my lawnmower broke one day. And of course, being a procrastinator, I didn't get a new lawnmower. And so everything started growing up. And I knew I had a couple of these plants in my lawn. And I live in Puerto Rico, by the way. And after things started growing up, I started seeing more. And so I'd take some flag and I'd put it in the ground wherever there was a plant. I ended up putting 90 some odd flags in my lawn. And my kids were going, Daddy, when are you going to take those things away? And well, I was just looking for, it was a project, but I was looking for a hypothesis. But after a couple of years, I decided to mow it. Anyway, they're still there. So anyway, a lot of orchids will grow in pastures and roadsides, coffee farms and cacao farms, places like that. Even tea farms. Actually, most orchids are epiphytic. That means they grow on other plants. They grow on up the trees. The vast majority of them do. Now, there's plenty of the ones you see on the ground because, well, they're a lot easier for humans to see, but a lot of them are up in the trees. In fact, there's something like almost 30,000 species of orchids. Somebody at Kew Botanical Gardens actually counted them. So we know there are about close to 30,000. And about 60-70% of them actually live in the tree. Well, it turns out a tree is an ephemeral habitat. And we all know that here. What happens when we have a hurricane? No electricity, I know that. But the trees get blown down. There goes the habitat for an epiphyte. All right. So this habitat is very ephemeral. And parts of the tree are more stable than others. Tree trunk, that's really stable. But the twigs come and go. And there are some orchids that specialize living on twigs of a tree. Well, if you live on a twig of a tree, you better have sex real fast. Because that twig is going to break and fall off. So you're going to have to grow quickly, have sex, produce fruits and seeds, and then disperse to the next habitat. That is a disturbed habitat. All right. Isn't this lovely? This is not something that's being served for dinner tonight. In fact, there's very little that would be of any nutritional value. This is an orchid fruit. It is split open, and these are the seeds. Depending on the size of the orchid fruit, you can have anywhere from about 100 seeds and a little fruit like that to about 3 million, 2 or 3 million. That's a lot of seeds. Okay, So seeds like that are like dust, and they just float in the air. So if you can just float in the air, you can get around. You know, I'm staying up at the shearwater, and I just wish I could float in the air so I can come down and then float back up without having to walk that horrendous. Horrendous. So I would say that orchids are very talented at getting around. And if you look in the West Indies, 60% of the orchids in the West Indies occur on more than one island. Now most of the islands here have not been connected, especially in the Lesser Antilles. Greater Antilles is another question. But in the Lesser Antilles, we haven't been connected. And this means that orchids get around. This is a horrible slide. But I have to have a few of them in here for you, so you can't figure out what I'm talking about. Basically what I did was I tried to determine, the orchid flora of, say, Puerto Rico, and figure out what islands are most closely like the flora of Puerto Rico. And it turns out, the big islands seem to group together. But the other islands, like, this island in the middle here, Mona, it seems to be more, the flora there seems to be more related to the Bahamas than it is to Puerto Rico or Hispaniola. Pretty crazy. This means that these orchids get around. This does not include the endemic species. This is just the orchids that occur on more than one island. Okay. The other thing about orchids that is surprising is that they are very resilient. You take Puerto Rico. In 1940, believe it or not, before I was born, 95% of that island was cut over. Only 5% of that island had natural vegetation on it. Okay. But as it turns out, of about 140 species that occur on Puerto Rico, there's only 1 or 2 species that seems to have been lost. This means that these orchids occurred in refugia, different little pockets of vegetation scattered throughout the island, and then they repopulated the habitat. Now, since 1940, there's a big economic change in Puerto Rico, and agriculture is, pretty much minimized, and it's an industrial type of economy. And so a lot of the land became reforested. And then there was a lot of species that came back into those reforested places. Like this Tulumnia variegata, angelitos or equitant oncidiums. When I first came to Puerto Rico, I would go out in places and there would be thousands of these things. You go into an area and when they were in flower, it'd just be white everywhere. It was gorgeous. It was amazing. And those habitats were secondary habitats. They weren't natural, old growth kinds of forests. But since then, these populations have begun to disappear. Because those early successional forests are now becoming later succession. The trees are bigger, there's less light, fewer orchids occur in the understory where these things were. Okay. So orchids can rebound, from this is the resiliency thing. They go from being little pockets of survivors, being survivors, and they can spread very quickly when the habitat changes. And there are some orchids that are even will thrive in urban or suburban kinds of conditions. This picture was taken in Hawaii. I took the picture because I like the garbage can right next to the coconut, and here are the orchids going alongside the coconut. And then this is an orchid that hardly many people don't see, and I think it might even occur here in Saba, but it likes lawns. And of course, when you mow your lawn, you don't see these things. But they'll sit there and until you forget to mow your lawn, and they will pop up. So the rebound, not only when you have habitat destruction, and when it starts coming back, the trees and the herbs and things start coming back. What comes back are also, well, not coming back, but it's part of this rebound are alien species, invasive species of various kinds. And here's a picture of a road in Hawaii, and we have these bamboo orchids growing alongside the road. They are native to Asia, so they're not native to Hawaii. And in fact, if you go online, there's something called a global compendium of weeds. Well, there are 90 orchids listed as weeds in that global compendium, and this is one of them. And here's my lawn. I keep on talking about my lawn. It's a great habitat. And you can tell that I mow my lawn, and when I see a spathoglottis pop up, well, then I go around it. So I've got some here. There's pink flowers right there, some more pink flowers there. And so they kind of march across my lawn. And this is an Asiatic species, one of those that have invaded. Well, okay, so if orchids are very resilient, and if orchids can get around very easily, why don't we have more weedy orchids? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons for this. One of them is that sex is not real common in orchids, but when it happens, it's pretty cool. And then there's, if you want to bypass, the surfaces of a pollinator to move the pollen to the stigma, then there's things like autogamy and apple mixes. And this is one of the species that does that, the Eulophia alta. And some others can get around vegetative spread, but most orchids don't do this. Here you have some cactus, little plantlets on the inflorescences. Some of you grow orchids, you see this. And then others are kind of viney or all around, like the Cepidendrum radicans. Does anybody grow this here? Yeah, does it have this growth habit? Yeah? Totally uncontrollable? Like your kids or something? Bring it over here. We have a sample. Let the orchid expert look at it.
All right.
That it's a match. All right. I think you shout bingo or something. Right. Okay. So what is a common thread about these orchids that do get around very easy and are weedy? Well, as it turns out, when you do the analysis, you find out that breeding systems, which means the way they do sex or don't do sex, it varies a lot. There's no common pattern there. Pollination systems, who they have as pollinators or how they attract pollinators, well, all that varies as well. And then where do they occur? Well, the habit. Habitats vary and their growth habit varies as well. This is a Cymbidium dianum, and it's from Asia. It's most of you who grow orchids know cymbidiums come from Asia. But it has gone wild in Hawaii. There's places on the Big Island where there's lots of cymbidiums on this particular species. And it seems to be pollinated by honeybees, which in Hawaii are invasive species as well. Okay. So the common thread may be disturbed habitats. I mean, really, that seems to be the most commonly invaded habitat. Roadsides, for example. That's a typical habitat for these things. And the other thing is that the plant pollinator associations are really non-specific. And if you watch Discovery Channel or National Geographic or something like that, they eventually, throughout the year, they will have a program on orchids or on pollination. And what happens is they show these marvelous, amazing systems of pollination, where the orchids are fooling the pollinators into copulating with them, or they're getting dumped in a pool of water, making them swim, and there's so many amazing things that are going on with orchids. But these guys, they're generally non-specific type of orchids. In fact, if there's an animal looking for, say, nectar, like this, and something like this, looking for nectar, it will go in here, into the flower, looking for it. And if the pollinator just happens to be the right size, it will actually come in contact with the stigma and pollinate the flower, and then as it leaves, it's carrying some pollen away. But any animal that has that kind of just general behavior will do the trick. Okay. But in a given site, there may be only one animal that does it. Okay. Now, orchids are mean. This is an orchid seed. And what is an orchid seed? I've already talked about orchid seeds are like dust. I wish I remembered to bring some orchid seeds, and I would have thrown them out at you and you would have been snorting them all night. But this is an orchid seed. And this thing in here is an embryo. This is taken with a microscope. And these are individual cells. And this embryo is sitting there and it has no food. You take a bean, and the bean has an embryo, but associated with that is a lot of food for that embryo to develop. All right? And so when you plant the bean, it has energy, to germinate and grow up and start photosynthesizing, get the light going, and that sort of stuff. But orchid, no, it can germinate. This embryo can start dividing, but it divided once or twice and going, eat a burger. It'll starve. So what orchids do is that these little things, when they get blown around, they land on the substrate, that the conditions are right, they will start leaking chemicals. And if a fungus is nearby, the right kind of fungus, the fungus will be that. I think there's something tasty nearby. And this fungus will start moving towards the orchid, because the fungus is looking for something to digest. And the fungus crawls into the orchid seed. Not crawls, they actually just grow, the hyphae just grow. But it crawls into the orchid seed, just to make it a little more dramatic. And it gets into these cells. Here's cells of an embryo. And these stringy things inside, those things are the hyphae. So it goes into the cells, The idea is to digest those cells. And here's one of these cells taken with a scanning electron microscope with all the hyphae. This is called a peloton. The thing is, the orchid has the enzymes to extract nutrients from the hyphae. And eventually, the hyphae becomes so weak, it just collapses like that. But the orchid gets food from the hyphae. So the orchid is actually parasitizing the hyphae, parasitizing that fungus. Of course, the fungus was after the orchid, but yeah. So, what do weedy species do? And here's a weedy species. This is the one I talked about before, the Angelitos or Equitacidium. Another one, Ionopsis utricularoides. They're very weedy. They grow on twigs, disturbed habitats. And they will, there's actually two strategies here. This one is a generalist, which means it will take any fungus around. Well, not any, but a variety of different fungi. And so this one is fairly common throughout the Antilles, especially the Greater Antilles. And it can be very successful because it's a generalist. It's like, oh, I'll pick you, it's fine. Then this one is a very specialized, will only parasitize a certain fungus. But it happens to be that fungus is everywhere. So it's a good way of doing it. Both ways. One to be a generalist, one to be a specialist on something that's everywhere. So, what should our view about the invasive species be? Okay. When we talk about invasive species, most of us think, oh, this is terrible. Invasion of the body snatcher. But on the other hand, most people don't think of orchids as being an issue. Yeah. You're kidding me. Orchids are invasive. Yeah. So how should we view these things? All right. When I talk to my ag friends, they say, oh yeah, orchids are terrible, because you bring orchids and they can have these pests on them, and, you order them from different places. They can have mites, they can have mealybugs, you name it. There's viruses, so they can be carriers of other invasive things that could jump to native species. So they could harbor vectors of plant disease. So they could be diseased themselves, or they can have insects or arachnids that will do it. Okay, Osteoclades maculata. Has anybody seen these here in Saba? Yeah, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Are you here for it? We're here for it. Oh, well, if you ever take a walk, give it another 5 years, you'll see these things everywhere. Yeah, they're here in Saba. We'll see them as we walk down Spring Bay Trail tomorrow. They're everywhere. They first arrived in Brazil in the early 1800s, and they have spread from Brazil. They're native to Africa. And one of the things about these guys is that they can be so common, at least in my experience in Puerto Rico. You could not walk through the forest without stepping on these things. Me being an orchid biologist, and I'm not going to step on an orchid. Oh, I can't do that. I can't do that. Then there's a wasp nest there, and it says, okay, I'll do that. And, it doesn't matter. These things are very, very strong plants. And the other thing about orchids is most people don't think, well, they're rare, they're kind of insignificant, little plants. Well, actually, the biomass of these things can be so bad. that in Hispaniola, in the Dominican Republic actually, in the cane fields, they were invading the cane fields. And so the workers, you know, it was getting so bad that then you know, the farmers said, hey, let's get rid of these Easteoclades maculata. Except I don't think that's what they call them. But so they took their machetes and they chopped them up. Well, by chopping them up, they just created a lot more Easteoclades maculata. It made things a lot worse than it was before. And so, by a friend of mine that worked on orchids there, what they did is they took bulldozers and they, you know, after they harvested the cane, then they just took bulldozers and piled up huge piles of this orchid, threw gasoline on them, and torched them off. And that took care of the problem. So, biomass could be an issue here, but you have to admit it's probably not a common occurrence. But there can be some very subtle interactions that might not be very good. Take Spathoglogus plicata. Anybody see this here? Anybody grows this?
It's here.
Yeah, I've heard rumors, probably by Mike, spreading these rumors. I also heard rumors spread very fast on Saba. You seen them? Where did you see them? Okay. Pink? Were they pink? Yeah, they you know, they're terrestrial orchids, and the stalk can be up something like this. And, anyway, it's spreading rapidly in Puerto Rico and other parts of. That's why I asked the question. I haven't seen it myself in Saba. So this thing is spreading rapidly, and it is attacked by this animal. That is a weevil, and this weevil looks really big, but actually the weevil is about 2 millimeters in size. Little black weevil. And here it is, and all this damage on the flower is caused by the weevil. The adults will munch on the flower, and then they'll have sex. So here's 2 of them here. They'll probably have some sex, and then the female will go to the ovary of the plant and lay their eggs in the ovary. And the larvae will eat the seed, the developing seeds of the plant. So that's the cycle. So it damages the flowers, it damages the fruits, it reduces seed production of this invasive orchid. And the weevil is native. So you're going, all right, the native is winning here. But other things are happening. This is a white form of the same species. And they produce what we call extrafloral nectaries. You think of nectaries in the flower, or the nectar is inside the flower, and that's something that the pollinator gets. Actually, these flowers offer nothing for pollinators. And in fact, the ones that are invasive, you know, self-pollinate themselves. But the extrafloral nectaries are nectaries on the outside of the buds, outside of the flowers, and ants, invasive ants, some native too. Invasive ants mostly will collect the nectar. And then they will attack the weevils. The weevils get too close, and the weevils kind of hide. Okay. Put on your seatbelts, we're going to talk a little science here. All right, so we did some experiments. And controls mean we didn't do anything. A group of plants. That means we had beetles and we had ants on the flowers, on the plant. And this percentage represents the percentage of flowers that produce fruit. Okay? And then we had a means of excluding the ants. So there were just beetles there. And there was a little bit of a drop. Okay, in fruit set. It looks like the beetles, you know, got a little more frisky. And then If you remove the possibility of having beetles and just have ants, then fruit set is pretty high, 56%. And if you exclude all those critters there, you get the same kind of fruit set. So what this actually tells you is that the beetles are bad news. And the ants may have a little bit of effect, not a big effect. Okay. But so what's the big deal about that? You know, they reduce, the beetles reduce seed production, but they're still invasive. They're still spreading like crazy. Here's another orchid that goes in the same kind of habitat and it has the same kind of growth habit. It's native, Blethia. And what happens with Blethia is that when it's growing near Spathoglottis, the Spathoglottis areas have lots of beetles. There's lots of food for the beetles. And there's spillover effect. The beetles will go over to the Blethia, and the Blethia looks terrible. Yeah, from it. Here, oh, here's one right there. There's one of the critters. So the beetles are eating up the Blethias, and reproductive success in the Blethias is much reduced. I mean, these are beautiful plants. It breaks my heart to see all the weevils munching on Blethia. So reproductive success is reduced, populations may decline here. So there is an indirect effect of having lots of beetles, native beetles, the population level has been pumped up by an invasive orchid. Okay. All right, so I talked about, you know, the bad stuff. But, you know, there's a possibility that some orchids that are invasive really don't do any damage. This is Epipactis helleborhini. If you're from Europe, you've seen this. It's in some places in Europe, it's very common. It has spread over to North America, and yeah, in certain areas, it's become very common. In fact, it appears in my mother's garden in California, and she goes, Jimmy, can you get rid of those things? I said, no, they're orchids. But, you know, they're just popping up everywhere. I said, no, at least let me get some data from it first. So I would go out and get some data, and I even enlisted her to get data, and she let me have it. We said, that's the last time I'm crawling under those bushes to get data for you. I want those orchids out right now. But she admitted that they look very pretty close up. But from a distance, they look terrible. Not terrible, but I guess beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. But in any case, these things have been, you know, weedy in various parts, but they probably have no harmful effects other than the aesthetic one. Now, if you want to talk about aesthetics, anybody here think this is an ugly orchid? Don't be shy. Okay, we have a unanimous opinion here. This is a pretty orchid. In fact, this is a hybrid orchid. It's grown in Hawaii that has escaped cultivation. It has spread as Dendrobium, well, I didn't even spell it right, Jacqueline Thomas. It has been used in lots of hybrid of Dendrobium hybrids. Some of you probably have some genes of Jacqueline Thomas in your Dendrobiums. Not that one. Maybe that one. No, those are not Dendrobiums. Maybe that one. In any case, you know, I was at a conference talking about these invasive orchids. And I noticed there was a group of people from Hawaii. Anybody here from Hawaii? Nobody from Hawaii. Anyway, there was like a table full of people from Hawaii. You can pretend you're from Hawaii. And, aloha. Aloha. Anyway, I said, hey, you have invasive species in Hawaii, and that invasive species in Hawaii is a really dirty word. I mean, they have SWAT teams that go out in helicopters and they paintball invasive species and they go over there and eradicate them, and it's amazing what they do. They have staffs of 100 people to go out and try to control certain invasive species. And I said, look, you have invasive orchids. Why didn't you do something about the invasive orchids? It's just like you guys, dead silence. And then one of them, offers up this explanation. Jim, it's because they're orchids. So it depends on what you appreciate, and so something like this, if it volunteers in your yard, you're not likely to eradicate it. So there's a possibility, of course, you can increase your biological diversity. We're going to hear more about diversity at sea, and there's a possibility of accelerating successional processes. I don't know how orchids would do that, but this is an excuse for other organisms. Increased functional redundancy. It's a fancy word, I'm not sure what it means, but scientists talk about that. So basically we have an issue here. We don't know whether something is good, it's indifferent, or it's bad. And my part of my research program is that we intend to find out. Okay. All right. Now I promised you I'd talk a little bit about Saba. And this orchid actually occurs here, but I took the picture in Stacia. But we're going to take this issue about invasive species a little different. Do invasive species affect the health of populations of orchids? And of course, as I mentioned before, we have a lot of species that are relatively rare, and this is one of those that's quite rare. There's a few populations here in Saba, and St. Eustatius, and a few other islands, but it's generally a pretty rare plant. And one way of approaching the question of whether that populations are healthy is to do population viability analysis, a fancy word to point out and see how well the populations are doing. And I've been doing this with Brassavola cuculata, which occurs here, and a number of other places in the world. And for various reasons, I ended up on St. Eustatius and developed a project on studying the population health of Brassavola cuculata. And in fact, here's a plant here, and there's a fruit right there. So there's been some sex going on in the population. Things are looking up. This is Hannah Madden, and she's a ranger. Some of you probably know her. She's a ranger over in Stenoff on St. Eustatius, and she helps us. Has helped us throughout this project, which has been going on for 6 years. And then Mike, you give him a big hand. Mike went already. And Michael Volken, who's no longer here, was very much interested in orchids, and I ended up, somehow we connected, and we decided that to extend the project of Brassivola cuculata here on Saba Island. And so we've been doing this for a couple years now, and hopefully we'll get good solid data to determine whether the health of these populations is okay. But one of the things that we noticed is that some of these leaves are not nice and long like they should be. And in fact, some of them disappear altogether. And we know they disappear. Here's a tag. This tag had a number on it, so we know this is numbered. Well, I can't read it. But this was a plant here, and it disappeared last year. Well, this year, actually, the latest census. And the question is, who is responsible? And of course, you see a plant removed like that, you think, oh, someone came up here and stole this orchid, you know. But then we look at closely, and it's not, it hasn't been removed like you would expect a human to remove something. And besides, anybody that goes to a place where this is growing has got to be crazy. It's not to say anything about your mental health, right? So, as it turns out, we have a number one suspect. There's a good friend of mine that's a picture fresh off the presses from yesterday. And this is from another time. Goats over here on Saba seem to be much more prevalent than over in St. Eustatius. And but on St. Eustatius, we have done a study where we measure how high the plants are off the ground. And anything about a meter and a half high, meter and a half up there, has a high probability of getting eaten. And, you know, getting eaten, partially eaten, and those plants at that height have the highest mortality. That means they have a higher probability of dying. You get up higher in the tree or up on the rock, then they're pretty much safe. So we have an idea that maybe this is goat height. And then we see so many goats here. And so we're wondering what is going to go on. So, tomorrow morning we're going to study poop and orchids. This is what we're going to look for. We're going to go down Spring Bay Trail. We're going to go into the area where there's orchids. And we're going up to the orchids. We have them all tagged. And we're going to take data from the orchids, see whether they've been eaten, how high off the ground they are. And then we're going to create these plots around the orchid in a radius of 2 meters. And we're going to count poop. Yeah. And we're going to find out whether the orchids that are eaten, more likely to be eaten, are in areas where there's lots of poop. And if there's lots of poop, there's likely to be lots of goats. All right? And then we're going to take measures. And if you're coming with us, my wife, Elvia, she's a plant ecologist, and she's really strict. And she's going to make you work. Well, a little bit. Because we want this data. This is not just going out and, having fun. Well, we're going to have fun, I guess, and sweat. We're going to have, at the end of the day, real data that will contribute to a paper we're going to write on the probability of survival and the population health of sable orchids. So, that's my advertisement for tomorrow. So thank you very much. I guess we're all hungry now. Do you have any questions? About anything about orchids, I can handle it.
Not worried about